This happened just this summer. My best friend Jonah and I are both in college and are outdoorsy kind of people. We'd go on hikes and sometimes go out camping when we had the chance as well. This year, when classes were out for the summer, we made plans to go camping by a lake that was a couple hours away from us. Now, it would be fair to say we weren't exactly experts at camping, but we also weren't entirely clueless either. We knew what we were doing at least, and didn't stay any longer than what we knew would be safe. We set out on the trail in the morning, prepared for 2 full nights out there. The hike took a bit longer than it was supposed to, but we got to the lake around midday. From what I know, there are hundreds of trails leading to this lake because of how big it is, and there were so many places to camp that it was extremely unlikely to run into anyone else. We didn't want to have to talk to other people, so when we arrived and saw nobody else was there, we were feeling quite good about things. The first hour, we just sat down and rested from the long hike. Then we put up our tents in the tree line, just outside range of the beach. By then, the sun was setting, so Jonah got a fire going, and I went out to collect some dry sticks to keep it running. I'd picked up a few not too far from our tents, when I suddenly began to hear a noise from just in front of me. I lifted my eyes and looked ahead. It was getting dark, but I could still see most of the woods. Pretty far back, there looked to be a person or something. After looking for a couple more seconds, I was able to see them distinctly walking and confirmed it was definitely a person out there in the woods. I quickly walked back to the campsite and told Jonah about it. We weren't exactly afraid or anything. It was just a little bit weird for someone to be out here wandering in the exact place we were. I think we also would have had a different feeling if they were just walking along the beach, but instead they were just wandering through the woods, not even on a trail. 15 minutes went by, and the sun had now passed the horizon, covering the woods in darkness. That's when we heard footsteps approaching. A moment later, a man appeared in the light from our campfire. He looked to be in his 30s, with a beard and shoulder-length hair. I immediately got a bad feeling about him. He smiled at us from across the campfire, then asked us if we knew the way to a specific place. I didn't recognize the name of it, but it sounded like a trail's name. "Sorry, we're not too sure where that is," I said. The man kept his smile and looked at us for another moment before turning around and wandering back into the woods. He didn't say anything else. I looked over at Jonah. Both of us were equally mystified and unnerved. After we were sure he was gone, Jonah asked me if that was the same person I'd seen before. I couldn't be 100% sure, but I was fairly confident it was. We spent the rest of that night by the fire, trying to think of reasons the man would be out there like that. The only thing that would make somewhat sense was if he got desperate for help once the sun went down, and he was lost or something. But that man didn't seem desperate at all. He asked for directions like everything was normal. He also wouldn't have just left after asking one question, right? Both of us were getting a little freaked out, so we let the conversation die out. Once it was getting closer to bed, we let the fire burn out as well, then climbed into our tents. I tried sleeping, laying there for at least an hour, just listening to the sounds of the woods. There was this weird feeling I was getting, though, that wouldn't let me close my eyes for too long without getting nervous. After somewhere around 2 hours of laying awake, I heard it. Footsteps sneaking towards our tent. I yelled Jonah's name and rushed out of my tent. I looked into the woods. A figure was standing 10 feet from me. A second later, they turned around and sprinted back into the woods, being hidden by the darkness. Jonah came out only in time to hear their footsteps running away. He said he knew exactly what was going on, though. We packed up that night and waited tiredly for dawn to make our way out of those woods. We don't know who that man was or why he was seemingly wandering so far out there with no equipment. If I hadn't stayed awake through the night, we may have never left those woods at all. I just want to warn you now before I start this story. If you're easily triggered, perhaps consider skipping over this one. This is a true and real experience, which happened to me when I was delivering newspapers one winter's morning. It was around 4 o'clock in the morning or so, and it was freezing out. I was on my usual paper route, delivering newspapers through the whole neighborhood. It was still shrouded in complete darkness, and the bitter winter winds were blowing strong. I was approaching an apartment block with my papers. I had to head around a dark corner of the building to continue. I was just turning it when I heard a voice. It sounded like people were talking. What the hell were people doing up at this hour, let alone chatting outside in this freezing cold? I squinted my eyes to get a better look as I drew closer. I saw there was a woman doubled over and crouching in the corridor before me. Instantly, I knew that something was wrong. As I got closer, I noticed that all this woman was wearing was her underwear. Why was she out here in the freezing midwinter morning alone with no clothes on? She was shivering profusely. I swiftly rode over to her and asked her what happened. Was she okay? Did she need any help? She wouldn't reply to me. She didn't even seem to have noticed I was there. I couldn't stand to see her like that. Before long, she would freeze. Her lips were already beginning to turn blue. I took my coat off and tried to put it around the woman. She pleaded with me not to give it to her and tried to push it off her. She muttered something about what if her husband saw her with a coat on. She would be in real trouble. In that moment, I knew I had to do something. I suspected this was some sort of cruel domestic violence going on here. I called the police immediately and waited with the woman for the cops to arrive. We were just outside her door apparently. She wouldn't say a word to me. I didn't know how long she had been out there, but it was truly a sad and haunting sight to see this woman all alone and freezing on this dark, cold morning. While we were waiting for the police to arrive, the front door burst open. Her husband came rushing out. Furious, he started shouting at her. She cowered back as he tried to throw a punch at her, not even minding that I was right there. Obviously, I had to intervene. Back then, I was about 20 years old. Luckily, at the time I was practicing martial arts, and I was strong enough to make the man think twice about assaulting any of us any further. At least until the police arrived a short while later. The woman broke down immediately and told the police this wasn't the first time he had forced her out into the freezing cold in just her undergarments. It seemed like this kind of thing happened to her all the time. That made me sick to my stomach. It was fortunate she'd even survived this time, let alone any others. I've always tried to see the best in people, but witnessing this incident just happening out of nowhere really rocked my confidence in human beings being decent. I mean, what kind of bastard do you have to be to throw your half-naked wife out into the cold to possibly die? Man, humans are terrifying. It was a snowy night when I pulled into the parking lot of my gas station. I worked the overnight 11 to 7 shift and had been at the job for several months before this. I didn't really like this job, but finding somewhere else to work was really difficult, and due to how things were in some other aspects of my life, night shifts were the best for my personal schedule. Still though, I went in tired every night and struggled to get through every shift. I parked in front of the building beside the only other car in the parking lot, which happened to be my coworker's. I went inside and relieved him of his own shift, and he left a couple of minutes later. Then it would be just me for the rest of the night. My manager had a paper on the desk with some of the things that needed to get done, but from reading it over, it wasn't actually all that much. My guess was that it wouldn't take any more than an hour total to complete all the tasks listed there. I tried to put it off as long as possible to save me from falling asleep. I wanted to start it up once I started getting really tired, so I wouldn't just conk out. As I sat there behind the desk, somewhere around 12 a.m. or so, a car pulled into the station. I glanced out of the window, seeing an old SUV parked by one of the pumps out there. Of course, with it snowing outside, most people were not driving around, but getting a customer every once in a while was perfectly normal. I went back to my phone and scrolled through some videos, not really paying much attention. Probably 10 minutes passed by until I looked back outside and saw the SUV was still out there by the pump. The headlights were off and the doors were closed. It looked like they should be out pumping gas, but it had been way too long for that. I stood up and got closer to the window, looking down both sides of the building. Nobody seemed to be anywhere outside. If they had just been in their car for the past 10 minutes with it shut off, they'd have to be freezing by now. It was snowy, windy, and cold. Honestly, I started to get a little bit nervous. I paid more attention for the next few minutes, waiting to see any movement for the windows or for someone to get back inside their car, but there was nothing. It was like the vehicle had just been abandoned right next to the pump. After some thought, I put on my jacket and went outside. Immediately, I knew I was right to worry. It was way too cold for anyone to be in there with the car off, or for anyone to even be outside for more than a few minutes. I rushed over to the car and looked around. I put my face close to the window and tried to look inside as well. "Hello? Is anyone in there? I'm just checking to see if you're okay." I called out, but from what I could see, there wasn't anyone inside. It wasn't exactly easy to see the interior though, so someone could have been in there. I was pretty sure there wasn't though. Now I was more confused than ever. I backed up and looked all around at the empty gas station parking lot. I started to walk back, now with my eyes not focused on the car. I was looking at the ground. I noticed footprints in the snow, going toward the building. Not really to the front of the building though, kind of off to the side somewhere. I looked back at the beginning of this trail. I saw it seemed to come from the car itself. At this point, I was freezing though, and didn't want to investigate any further. I went inside and turned on the small heater next to the counter, putting my hands up in front of it to warm them. I was only inside for 30 seconds to a minute before a loud thump resonated through the building. It sounded like it had come from somewhere behind me. I spun around, but I didn't see anything. I walked around the corner and to the back. On the floor, there were puddles of dirty water, like snow had been melting off someone's boots. I felt a chill run through me. I stepped closer to the back room and turned the corner to where the supply room was. Standing in the dark, hiding behind one of the shelves, I could see the outline of a figure. They were tall, with broad shoulders, and had a large scruffy beard. They were looking right at me. My heart stopped for a moment, but after the initial shock, my reaction was to walk back to the counter. I don't know why. Maybe I was just too shocked to react appropriately. After staring at the doorway to the supply room for who knows how long, with no signs of any movement, I quietly picked up the store phone and called the police. I whispered for help and endured the most unnerving 10 minutes of my life as I waited. During this time, I didn't hear or see anything from the supply room, which honestly added to my fear. For some reason, the man never emerged to confront me. When 2 cops finally pulled in, they came inside, and I quietly told them where the man was. They searched the room while I stayed by the front, but I was shocked when they came out with nobody else in tow. The man was gone. The watery shoe prints surrounded the back door, and outside there were fresh tracks in the snow, going straight away from the gas station into the completely empty dark field that led on for miles. Obviously, nobody could search that at night, but even when they did in the following days, they didn't find anything. I mean, the field was huge. He could have gone anywhere really, but it was so cold and windy that night, I was sure they would find a body or something. The SUV was taken in for hopefully more information. I don't know how or why, but for some reason they couldn't find any history of ownership. That left us with just what we know from that night. And we're still left with only that. Who the man was, what he was doing, it all remains unsolved. Where he is now is just as much of a question, really. For reasons which will appear obvious quite shortly, I would like to keep my identity a secret. I work in a high school, and I've worked there for about 15 years now. Again, I don't want to say exactly which one. One recent afternoon, about 20 minutes after all the classes had finished up, I was passing by the homeroom classroom when I noticed two female students all alone, stood opposite one another and deep in conversation. They were speaking using whispered voices. I know it's not right to eavesdrop on a student's conversation, but there was something about their body language which made me stop and stand by the door to see if something was going on here. Something seemed weird about this. I don't really know how to explain it. It was just a feeling, really. To my best recollection, this is what I began to hear as I listened in. How about jumping? No, people would see, maybe try to intervene. How about hanging? Yeah, I think we can do that. That's definitely an option. What about going in front of a train? We can't do that. Think of the security cameras. Well, that conversation obviously made my blood run cold. It was mind-boggling. Two young students with their lives ahead of them, talking about suicide in such a carefree manner. It really shook me up pretty bad. I'm a pretty hot-headed guy, and I wouldn't be able to live with myself if I just sat there and did nothing. After hearing this conversation, I would worry about those girls until the end of time itself. I went straight into the classroom to talk to them. Hey, you two, I called out to them. Stop talking like that. It's not good. I let my emotions get the better of me. That's never the answer. If you're having troubles, try and talk to someone. You can talk to me if you need to. They looked at me in silence, both of them just staring. They had this really cold gaze. I was deeply concerned for them. I didn't feel like I was getting through to them at all. Needless to say, I was very surprised when one of them said this. We're not talking about suicide, you idiot. We're talking about killing someone and making it look like a suicide. I was so shocked I didn't know how to react. The two girls ran out of the classroom, laughing a mischievous laugh. I couldn't move. I was so surprised by what I'd just heard. Those two weren't in my class. I decided to do some investigating afterward, and now that I've had time to think about it, I don't think I had ever seen those two at that school before. I haven't seen them ever since either. This only happened in September of this year. As far as I know, nothing nefarious has happened yet, but it's made me quite paranoid. Just a really weird and disturbing experience that I don't think I'll ever be able to forget. I live out by the Rocky Mountains in the Northwest. I don't go camping all that often anymore now that I'm older, but I'd say that I go out there maybe once a year or so. I'm more of a sitting in the backyard kind of person, but going out into the mountains was always worth the hassle whenever I did. This happened a couple of years ago now, when I'd gone out in the early weeks of fall. The trail I chose was only a 20-minute drive from me. I parked off the side of a small dirt parking lot, then grabbed my bags and started walking. It was a little bit colder than I was anticipating, but the trail was a really nice walk. When I got to the campsite, I set everything down and got my tent put up. It was a very small open area with nothing but trees surrounding it. There were no other tents or anything, so it looked like I was going to be the only one camping out here. The sun was still pretty high up, so after a quick break, I set out on a thin side path that went to an overlook of the mountains I saw online. I'd done some research before I left and found that it was only a 10-minute walk from the campsite, so I didn't bring much with me other than a water bottle and my basic backpack. When I got there, I sat down and enjoyed the view. I waited for about half an hour. It didn't look like anyone had been out here, which, seeing as it was starting to get colder out, I guess that made a lot of sense to me. Once I was ready, I got up and walked back to the campsite. When I walked up to the open area, though, something felt wrong. Nothing I'd left behind looked like it did when I'd left it. Everything was just slightly off. I checked around for anything missing or obvious things having been moved around, but everything was still there. Part of me wondered if maybe I was just being paranoid. Everything I felt was off was easily things that I could have just misremembered. Like, I was pretty sure I'd zipped up my tent before leaving, but it was unzipped when I got back. That's not exactly something an animal could do. There were no other signs of people having come by, though, so the obvious answer would be that I'd just forgotten that I didn't zip the tent before leaving. Thing is, I very clearly remember doing so. I tried to just relax a bit, putting my chair up and moving some stones around to make a fire pit. The sun was going down, and the cold was really setting in. I warmed up some water to make tea with, and sat there in my own thoughts. After some time, probably around an hour or so, I heard someone walking in the distance. I turned toward the sound, seeing that it was coming from an area where a trail was at, but it was too dark now to see anything beyond the open area. While I watched and listened, it sounded like they were coming in toward the campsite. There were a few seconds where I didn't hear anything, almost like they were looking at me from somewhere out on the trail. Then the footsteps started again, walking away from the campsite, but not back on the trail. It sounded like they were walking off into the woods, off to the side of my campsite. I didn't know what was going on, but I was getting a little creeped out now. The thoughts of everything seeming off before had started to come back to my mind now that I knew someone else really was out here. I didn't know if they'd been there earlier or if they had just arrived, but that's why it was so unnerving. The footsteps started to get louder again, coming toward the campsite from the opposite side. I shifted my gaze to check, but not even a second later, I heard another set of footsteps start coming from behind me. Both were quiet and subtle, but given everything now, it was clear they were trying not to be seen as they moved in closer. I quickly unzipped my bag and pulled out my handgun. I had this on me for desperate situations. I stood up and held it toward the trees, where I could hear one of them approaching from. I didn't say anything, afraid to show fear in my voice. I knew they must be able to see me in the light from the campfire. I was hoping my gun would be enough to make them second-guess whatever they were trying. It went quiet. Both footsteps stopped at once. I turned all around, looking for any sign of movement in the darkness. After a minute of no sounds at all, I started to put things back in my bag, being careful not to put down my weapon for more than a few seconds at a time. I'd not heard them leave yet, so I knew they had to be watching me from somewhere out of the light's range. Once I got what I could fit into my bag, I started to make my way to the trail, leaving only the tent behind. From what I could hear, they didn't attempt to follow me out. Once I got a decent distance away, I turned on my flashlight and made it the rest of the way to my car. To sum it up, the police were useless in this kind of scenario. Whoever the two people were that were out there, they had never shown themselves at all, and they didn't get a chance to do anything to me because I pulled out my gun. Don't get me wrong, it was very obvious they were planning on doing something to me, but there wasn't enough to go off of. After my encounter and seeing a lot of these situations happen to others as well, I don't think I'll ever be going out there on my own again. This happened when a buddy and I were on our way to a ski resort. I was driving and my friend was co-pilot. He sat with a road atlas across his knees. This happened before sat-navs and smartphones. I distinctly remember every 5 minutes my friend saying, "Oh, it's not much farther now." I was in a kind of bad mood, since the snow looked as if it was gonna stop. My friend had this idea that if the snow was easing up, we could take a shortcut through a kind of country lane. "This'll be a complete failure," I said to him. "Nah, man, we're so close. I got a good feeling about this shortcut. It's fine." I wondered if this trip was even going to be worth it or not. I thought about turning back, because if there was no fresh snow while skiing, it wouldn't be anywhere near as fun. I couldn't just pop a U-turn on the highway though, so at least if I tried this mountain road, I may get the chance to turn the car around if I needed to. I got onto that winding road and made sure I went slow and steady. The trees were dense and in full growth. The road was dark, basically just a mud track full of darkness. Upbeat music was playing on the radio, in complete contrast to the situation. The two of us weren't speaking at all. I wanted to get back on the main road, so I sped up a little. There was nothing but trees around here, no houses or anything. We were on this back road for about an hour when we finally saw some signs which showed that the highway was coming up soon. It was at this point my friend called out to me, "Hey, look, there's someone there." I could see the figure of a man standing by the side of the road. I slowed down to see what was going on here. The guy by the road was waving us over and had a big smile on his face. I guessed he looked about 30 years old. I pulled the car over and the man approached. He knocked on the passenger side window, so I rolled it down just a crack. "Thank you so much for stopping. My car just broke down. Do you think you could help me out maybe?" he said. I didn't see a car anywhere nearby, so I didn't say anything. My friend must have been thinking the same thing, because he didn't say a word either. Something was definitely weird about this situation. All of a sudden, after a moment of silence, the man tried to jam his fingers through the gap in the window and force it downward. I hit the lock button just as he began trying to open the door. "Hey, come on, open it!" His friendly rescue me persona melted right away. He began getting angry and kept trying to get into my car. He rattled the door and pulled out a large hunting knife. He began to attack the window. "Get out of the car now!" At that point, I hit the accelerator and we peeled it out of there, leaving the man running after us on the road behind. Always keep your wits about you and stay safe out there. Who knows when you'll encounter a psycho? I worked at a restaurant with my older brother during our high school years. It was a really small restaurant in an outlet shopping center. We were both waiters there, but since the place was small, we often helped out all around, doing dishes, deliveries, whatever they needed really. After just a year of working there, my brother graduated high school and chose to go to college. He quit working there, but I stayed for a while. This happened a few months before I eventually left the job. It was Friday, so I was working a later shift than I usually did on other weekdays. The restaurant was open until 12 every night, but because of school, I usually never stayed late. no later than 8 or 9. Anyway, I was scheduled to close this night, alongside the manager. Everything was going pretty normal, slowing down by 8 and getting a few people picking up orders for the rest of the evening. At 10:30, my manager picked up a phone call for a delivery though. By 11 p.m., I was driving out of the parking lot and out onto the road. The address I was given on the receipt was just 8 minutes away from the store. As I drove a couple minutes down the road, I got a call from my manager. I answered right away thinking they must have canceled, but apparently the guy had called back saying he'd given the wrong address on accident. I pulled over and wrote down the new address. I typed in the new street into GPS, but right away I knew something was off here. It wasn't close at all. It was 25 minutes away, and the opposite direction of where I'd been going. If they had given this address to begin with, the order would have never been accepted this late. I thought about just going back to the restaurant and telling my manager, knowing he would understand. But I was already out there, and we had already taken the order, so I just started driving. The roads were pretty empty around town at this time of night. The further out I drove, the more desolate they became. I didn't even see any cars for the last 5 minutes of the drive. This was taking me out to the far edge of town, where most of the buildings and houses turned into grassy fields and lines of trees. When I approached the road the address was on, all I could see were a row of houses with all the lights off. As I drove down and past more of the houses, a few of them did have their porch lights on, but it still felt like a very empty area. It's worth mentioning these were not the nicest houses either, by any means. They were all single-story box-style homes. I pulled up to the one I was set to deliver to and parked on the side. Getting out with the food, I felt a strange, eerie sense as I walked up to the door. It was quiet outside. There were no streetlights and barely any house lights. It was extremely dark in this area. I knocked on the door and waited while a whole minute passed by. There was no sign of anyone being home. I was starting to get more and more uneasy. I just set the bag down and turned to walk back to my car. They hadn't paid yet, but the food was probably cold already, and it was of no use to me anyway. When I looked over at my car, though, a man was standing right behind it. He was leaned over like he was looking into the window. I stopped in place. I don't know if the man heard me approaching or what, but he immediately looked up at me. I could barely make out his face, but he was an older man. "Do you need something?" The man didn't move. I asked again, but nothing changed. That eerie sense was getting stronger. I looked around, but I didn't see anything other than trees in the dark. The man took a few steps back, moving away from my car and standing maybe 5 feet from the door. After a moment, I started walking over slowly, hoping to just get in and leave. As I got right up to the door, the man continued to stare at me from just a few feet away. I cautiously opened the door and rushed inside, but before I could even turn it on, the guy started yelling. I looked over at him, seeing him now facing the woods and just screaming gibberish. I turned my head slightly to look where he was looking. In the woods, I could see 2 or maybe even 3 figures rushing toward my car. My immediate thought was that this was a setup, and I needed to leave instantly before something happened. I turned my car on and shot out of there, just as the man next to me tried to move behind my car in an attempt to stop me. I was able to get out. Seeing and hearing the group of men yelling at me, I sped away. The cops were called, and though not much was able to be found, there were a few things. The address I was supposed to deliver to was apparently a vacant property. It wasn't technically abandoned, but the owners didn't even live in the state anymore. It wasn't for sale either. It was just left as is, rotting away for the past decade. The caller that placed the order was unknown, but the initial address he gave seemed to have no significance. Who the group was, what they planned to do, so many other things are left with no resolution. I'll probably be wondering about it for the rest of my life. After all, had anything played out a little bit differently, I may not even be here right now. I remember when I was a child, I loved nothing more than to go out in the crisp white snow and play, to make footprints in the pure snow where no one else had before. It was bliss. This happened to my brother and I when we were kids. I remember on that day it had been snowing non-stop since the morning. My brother and I were itching to get outside and play in the snow. My mom said we couldn't go out there until the snow had stopped though. We were pretty sick of playing indoors at this point. 5 p.m. rolled around, and it began to get slightly dark outside. The snow had finally stopped though. Even though it was winter and it was past 5 p.m., it wasn't too dark out to see, so we pleaded with our mom to let us go out for just a little bit. She finally agreed, as long as it wasn't for more than an hour. We raced out to play in the snow. Even though it was very dim and gloomy out, thanks to the snow, it didn't seem all that dark. We lived out in the countryside back then. Pretty much right in front of our house, there was nothing but rice fields, which had now become pure white fields of snow. We were loving it, crunching the fresh snow underfoot. There were no other footprints in sight. This was our snow. Soon my brother and I had made this patch of snow all bumpy and misshapen. It wasn't fresh and untouched any longer, so we went in search of pure white snow to play in. We walked further from our house. It was hard to see where the road began and the fields ended, but we found a field just ahead of a single street light. The light made it look like the snow was shimmering. That was the perfect snow we were talking about. What would we do with this patch of snow? We decided to use our footprints to make a giant smiling face. We planned out how we would make the face and got to work right away. We were totally immersed in our footsteps. We didn't have much time to create our masterpiece. Maybe someone would see it from the sky later. I think it took no longer than 15 minutes to finish our feet artwork. We went back to where we thought the road was, to see our art beneath the streetlight. I was really happy with it. I looked over to my brother when I noticed he was staring somewhere beyond the field. He looked really concerned. He began to breathe heavily. I looked in the direction he was staring at, and I started breathing heavily myself. We shot each other glances to see if we were seeing the same thing. Just beyond our art in the snow was a figure in the snow. A woman in a wedding dress, a white kimono bridal gown. We couldn't believe our eyes. We were sure we were the only ones in the field just now. I saw traces of my footprints and my brother's, but not that woman's. She made no imprint in the snow at all. The woman began to move towards us. My brother and I broke into a run, and we aimed for the likes of our family home. We ran as fast as we could, screaming and shouting for our mother. She threw the door open and came out with a concerned look on her face. We blurted out what we'd just seen. She listened to our story, but just laughed it off. She didn't even look outside. A few years later, when I was in high school, I asked my little brother about that one snowy night. I said, "She was creepy, that bride in the snow, huh?" I didn't like that I couldn't see her face because of the way she was bent over. He said that he remembered that night well. "Oh, that bride in the snow? We didn't see her head because she didn't have one." He looked pale. It made me shiver. Whatever happened to that girl out there, I'm convinced that that day we saw a ghost in the snow. What is up, guys? Blue Spooky here. Thank you guys so much for watching, especially if you made it this far to the end of the video. If you liked the video, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you feel so inclined. If you have any feedback for me as well, be sure to leave that in comments below the video. If you guys have a story you'd like to send in, or if you'd like to contact me for any reasons, there will be links to my social media in the description below the video, including my Facebook, Gmail, and Twitter accounts. Go ahead and send me a message on any of those, and I'll try to get to you as soon as possible. If you do decide to send in a story, please be sure to include in the tagline what the name of the story is if it has one, what type of story it is if it has one, and how you'd like to be credited in the description below the video. Please make sure to include as much detail as you feel comfortable with and try to use as much proper grammar as possible to make sure you have the highest chance of appearing in a future video. Overall, I think that's pretty much it for now, guys, so thank you so much for watching, and I hope you guys have a great day.